and the Evelyn's.
Call this work session to order. We'll start with introductions. You, Mr. Gates.
Dean Gates, Assistant Counsel.
Deborah Kelly.
Bronson Fry.
Forrest Dunbar.
Christopher Constant. Felix Rivera.
Suzanne France.
Pete Peterson.
Great. And
Fred Dyson.
Fred Dyson. We are going to speak today about responsible contracting. It was a topic raised by Mr. Constant. We don't yet have an ordinance before us, but we have some people here to do some introductions. Do you want to say anything before we get to our guests, Mr. Constant?
Sure. I'd say that for about the last 2 or 3 months, I've been in conversations with some of my peers on the community discussing how we can ensure that the municipal code has the strongest protections for the people in our community who are doing the work. So we will be having an introduction of a draft ordinance coming up. But before we did that, we thought it would be wise to have a discussion about what the problem is we're trying to solve with this move to change the municipal code. So with that, I'd like to hand it to Gallo and have Ms. Kelly make her presentation.
Great. And for those in the audience, we have more than enough sandwiches. Please get some sandwiches or chips. Food's in the back there. But yeah, Ms. Kelly, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Deborah Kelly, and I'm coming here as a private citizen. I spent 12 years in the construction industry, and then the last 2.5 years as the Director of Labor Standards and Safety for the Department of Labor and Workforce Development.
Okay. And so if you want to just sort of broadly introduce what we're doing here, start by discussing wage theft.
Sure. So my understanding is we'll be talking about wage theft and worker misclassification, 2 related subjects. And wage theft is very simply defined as when a worker is not paid their legally or contractually obligated wages. So wage theft can mean or happen a lot of ways. It can be when a worker is not paid at all, when a worker is not paid for all the hours they work, when a worker is not paid minimum wage or overtime, when they don't receive their final paycheck after leaving a job, or when they're not paid the wages they're owed under Davis-Bacon or Little Davis-Bacon prevailing wage laws. So that's kind of the broad summary of what wage theft is.
No, for the record, we've been joined by Mr. Weddleton. Please continue.
And worker misclassification, which I believe Bronson will cover in more in depth, is when a worker is classified as an independent contractor when in fact under the law they are an employee. So whether an employee is an independent contractor or they're an employee is defined under various labor laws. In pretty much every case, it's defined by the nature of their work they're doing and the relationship they have with the employer. But some employers find that by calling their workers independent contractors, they can save a lot of money. They don't need to pay workers' compensation, unemployment insurance. They're not responsible for occupational safety and health standards for that employee. And that can result in a big savings for the employer at the expense of the employee. So I've been asked to talk about whether wage theft and worker misclassification is a problem here in Alaska. Wage theft's a problem everywhere. The Economic Policy Institute in 2017 estimated that wage theft results in $15 billion a year being taken out of employees' pockets nationwide, and that it affects about 17% of low-wage employees. Alaska, we don't have those numbers exactly. We do have these wage and hour reports that we'll go over a little bit later, but there's no reason to believe that it's any less prevalent here than anywhere else. And anyone at Wage and Hour can tell you that's what they deal with every day. Misclassification often goes hand in hand with wage theft, since it allows employers to skirt minimum wage and overtime laws, but it has impacts that are a lot broader than just wage theft. In 2017, a young man was killed while he was working to prepare a retaining wall for demolishing. The retaining wall was clearly damaged and was bowed, and he was removing a wooden staircase that was obviously bent from the pressure of this cement block retaining wall. And when he removed the bolts that bolted that staircase to the ground, the retaining wall collapsed on him and killed him. The employer in that case asserted that this young man was an independent contractor, despite the fact that this young man was obviously not in business for himself, worked only for this person, used his tools, was told when to go to work, and in every account was an employee. But the really telling thing about this story, I think, was when looking at the bid documents, he had been able to underbid his competitors for that job. The employer had been able to underbid his competitors by 30%. So he saved a lot of money, but at the expense of this young man's life. He didn't have to provide safety training. He didn't have to provide the shoring plan that OSHA requires for demolishing a structure of this nature. And because of that, the wall collapsed, and the young man had no understanding of the dangers involved. Worker misclassification is particularly prevalent in several industries. I would definitely say the construction industry is one where I've primarily seen it, and I'll leave that more to Bronson to talk about. But bad actors really realize that they can get away with it pretty often, and that when they do get away with it, they can save a lot of money and underbid their competitors, which makes the industry a lot harder for success for those who are following the laws. I was going to now move on to how the state of Alaska responds to wage theft. Yes.
Yeah, I just want to note for the record, we've been joined by Mr. Trainee.
My driver was late, sorry about that.
It's okay. Triumphant return to work sessions. Thank you, Mr. Trainee. I think I acknowledged Mr. Wellington before. Mr. Dyson, do you have a question before she continues?
No. Yeah, if that's cool.
Yeah, of course.
What makes an independent contractor legitimate? I assume it's license and so on, and I share your concern about people who are misusing that. But how would we, what would be the basis on which we would assume this guy is a legitimate contractor?
So the answer to that depends on the labor law that they're under. So wage and hour law and workers' comp, they look at it individually. But in pretty much all cases, they are looking at whether the worker took steps to be an independent business. Like, did they go and get a contractor's license? Did they go get a business license?
Right.
Also, are they bringing their own tools and materials to work? Are they advertising to work for multiple people, or they only have a relationship with this one employer?
Yeah, that's all legitimate.
Yes. And there are other factors as well where you look, it's basically looking at the relationship and saying, is this person dependent on this other person, this employer? Are they dependent on them, or are they independent? Are they able to go out and get their own work and do their own business?
Yeah, man, I assume that most all the, you and I think of as employees that are under the guise of being an independent contractor are doing so somewhat willingly, but with significant inducements. And one issue is, do those guys or people really understand what they're doing and the legal implications and downsides and stuff? My guess is they don't. Most of them, their employer says, yeah, I'm glad to give you a job, here's the deal. They don't think it through. Is that a bad assumption?
I think that's a very fair assumption. And again, Bronson probably can speak to this better than me, but a lot of times these are young people trying to get into the construction trade, and they're told that's the way it is. You're an independent contractor, and in return you get to learn the trade.
Yeah.
So.
All right, thank you.
Absolutely.
So I know, Ms. Kelly, you're no longer with the state, but obviously you've got a lot of experience there. Could you tell us a little bit about what the state is doing to respond to these issues?
Sure. So one of the primary duties of the Wage and Hour Administration is to recover wages from employees who weren't paid properly. So the Wage and Hour Administration takes wage claims, so an employee comes in and says, I wasn't paid properly, and then they pursue those wages on behalf of that employee, of course at no cost to the employee. That's kind of the bare bones basic job that Wage and Hour does every day, and that's what's reflected in these reports. But in addition to that, there are a lot more steps the state has taken. In the last few years, the state formed a misclassification committee that brought a lot of various agencies together, like workers' compensation, unemployment, wage and hour, and many more, to meet monthly or every other month and talk about the issues and go after the employers that were the worst actors, because they're not just violating one law, they're not violating just minimum wage and overtime, they're violating that whole pool of laws when they misclassify an employee. So that misclassification committee showed some really positive outcomes, especially in that case where that young man was killed, that the expertise of various agencies came together to hold that employer responsible. The legislature also passed House Bill 79 last year, which created a new independent contractor definition for workers' compensation. And that is a much more bright line test than used to exist. It used to be this balancing act of, well, what's their relationship? How dependent is one on the other? And a lot of people would take advantage of that gray area to call their workers independent contractors. So this new definition, at least for workers' compensation, makes it, one, easier for employers to understand and know that they're classifying their workers correctly, and two, easier for workers' compensation to pursue workers' comp fraud cases against employers who are misclassifying their employees, because it's no longer this mushy gray area in the middle. Wage and Hour has also started pursuing a more systematic approach against employers who seem to be violating laws for all of their employees. So Wage and Hour has the ability to pursue wages on behalf of employees who file wage claims. And in the past, they would always take the wage claim, get the employee paid, and that was the end of the story. But they're seeing wage claims come in over and over and over with certain employers, and started what's called directed compliance audit. It's done in some other parts of the country, and Federal Wage and Hour is also doing a similar kind of enforcement now. It's a relatively new concept, at least up here, where if it seems an employer has a systematic problem, they work with the employer and get all of the records for all of the employees and take it as a whole. And that really came to fruition with the Gallows and Taco King case in 2016 and 2017. Wage and Hour recovered almost $1 million in wages and liquidated damages for unpaid overtime for Gallows employees, which is pretty significant considering that Wage and Hour can only go back 2 years.
Wow. And no
So-
wonder those burritos were so cheap. Dang it, they were violating, I didn't know they were violating labor laws. It's unfortunate. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, back in the good old days, there used to be employers that would hire individuals and call them managers or manager trainees, put them on a salary, and then work them 12, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, until they quit and they'd hire another one. And obviously, they weren't managers. They were basically doing the same job as a part-time employee would do. But since they were managers, you know, the employer was taking advantage of the situation. I don't know if that happens as much anymore, but that used to be extremely prevalent, especially in the restaurant business.
It still happens, although Wage and Hour is pretty good at looking at the nature of the work the person's actually doing and attempting to classify them correctly.
No, for the record, we've been joined by Mr. Croft. We've got a question from Mr. Dyson, and then Mr. Weddleton, and then Mr. Trainee, and then I know you still have more to present to us. Go ahead, Mr. Dyson.
So Little Davis Bacon only applies on government jobs, right?
That's correct.
And there are lots of, quote, performers around, including exotic dancers who are individual contractors.
They shouldn't be. In fact, Alaska's case law that established our test for employee-employer relationships was based on a case of exotic dancers being shown to be employees under, I think it was Alaska State Supreme Court ruled that dancers are in fact employees. So if they're misclassified, then that would be a misclassification.
Is there a tip accommodation goes with that? Never
No,
mind.
there's not.
Thanks.
Okay, Mr. Welton, then Mr. Train.
There's more help me to the end.
Yep, Mr. Train.
You took the Fantasies case where they were misidentifying their employees. Remember whole wage system was screwed up.
So the case law that established the employer-employee relationship test was not the Fantasies case. It's much older. It was the Fowler, I believe. Excuse me, I may not be remembering that case correctly, but it's much older than Fantasies. The Fantasies case has gone through several iterations. As you may be aware, a private lawyer pursued wages on behalf of several Fantasies employees and was successful in having those employees defined as employees and not as independent contractors. And shortly after, Fantasies moved to a model wherein they called their employees tenants, and that case is still ongoing.
Huh. Okay, well, please continue. Is this, did you bring this to us? Is this part of your presentation?
I did not bring that, but I have been asked to speak to it, so I will go over a few of the numbers briefly.
Sure.
and what they mean and be able to answer any questions.
Yeah, please let us know what this is.
Okay. Prior to that, if I can, I just had a couple more points for what the state's doing
Sure.
to address wage theft and worker misclassification. The state has implemented Administrative Order 286 recently, which allows the state to debar employers from state contracts if they have been found to be willful or egregious violators of labor laws. So that means if they're repeat or willful violators of workers' compensation, wage and hour, or OSH laws, they can be submitted to the Department of Administration to be debarred from being able to be state contractors or vendors. That's something that happened relatively recently and is still kind of being tested.
Has it happened to anyone yet?
No. However, the state has had in place for a very long time a very similar process for Little Davis-Bacon violators. So if a state contractor violates our state's prevailing wage laws repeatedly or egregiously, they can and are debarred from state contracts after that for 3 years.
Mr. Constant.
Thank you. That brings up an interesting point. We have you both presenting on wages and misclassification, but a third plank to this move is safety, right? And to me, that's a very important one to be talking about. And so if you have any perspective on that, that would be good too, because you started with the case of an individual who was killed because of an industrial accident. And to me, that's the most moving part of this conversation.
Well, safety is definitely near and dear to my heart. I came from a hazardous industry. I was injured in a workplace accident and then came to work for the state, partly overseeing the Alaska OSH program. So it's definitely something I care about. And worker misclassification is huge with safety because when a worker's an independent contractor, there is a presumption there that they have taken upon themselves to become an expert in their field, and now they're going into business for themselves as an electrician, as a drywall installer, as anything. But when someone misclassifies an employee, there's no expectation that they know what they're doing. Oftentimes these people are right out of high school and they're brought onto a job, and if they had been an employee, they'd be owed safety training, personal protective equipment. They'd have to follow workplace rules that would keep them safe, and without that, there's nothing. There's no obligation from the employer or the employee to keep them safe, and that's huge. I mean, there's really no better example than the one I talked about, the young man killed in the retaining wall collapse. That was
Thank you,
heartbreaking.
Mr. Constant. Okay, so do you have anything more on this topic, on the state, or do you want to go on to the wage and hour report?
I do not have anything else on the state.
Okay.
So if you look at this report, this is basically Wage and Hour's internal tracking document. And we can look at, I would recommend looking at the 2018 report, which is the second to last and last pages. So if you go to the second to last page, since we're talking about wage stuff, I can quickly go over the numbers that are actually relevant to that topic. The very first line, 1A, is new claims filed. So those are wage claims. Those are employees who have come to Wage and Hour and said, I want your help getting my wages back. So this is a small portion of the overall employees who may actually have wage issues because they have to be willing to come to Wage and Hour, give up their anonymity, and give over their claim to Wage and Hour, as opposed to pursuing it with a private attorney. So in FY18, which is July 2017 to June 2018, we had 164 wage claims at the state. Previous year, 245. Year before that, 228. And then if you go to the next page,
Before you move on,
Yes.
when was that administrative order implemented?
the final implementation was late this summer, sometime like August, I think. Correct.
No, and this is, unless I'm misreading this, that 164 is year-to-date as of June, so, half the year, it looks like it could.
So this is the fiscal year, so the June
Oh, okay.
reports encompass the entire fiscal year.
So it
So,
is-
yeah, it would be the full year.
Okay, thanks.
So if you could turn the page to the final page, there's a heading that says collections. It's the fourth heading down. And line number 15, wages, that would be the minimum wage and overtime wages that were underpaid and that Wage and Hour collected on behalf of employees. So you see on the rightmost column, which is FY18, there's 154,000 collected. Previous year, 169. Year before that, 151,000. And it's significant to point out that as of now, Wage and Hour is not counting their directed compliance audit wages within that number, so the gallows number would have been accounted for separately. That may change at some point, but that's how they've chosen to do it at this time. And then down at line 20, you see prevailing wage deficiencies. It's the same concept, but these were underpaid or unpaid prevailing wages as opposed to state minimum wage and overtime. And you'll see that numbers are a lot higher there, partially because Wage and Hour gets records for all payroll done on public construction, so the record keeping is way better. It's a lot easier for Wage and Hour to spot problems and to address them than through, people here and there coming in with wage claims, which are generally quite small in amount compared to Title 36 public construction prevailing wage issues. And then that's pretty much the broad brush. Line 23, other, the first thing is the Title 23 directed compliance audit. So those are the audits, the company-wide audits I was talking about earlier, such as in the Gallows case. Those are wages recovered. And then the total collections under totals, line 25C, is the total amount collected on behalf of employees. So that's not just wages, that's also liquidated damages and waiting time penalties. But it's important to remember that all of that money goes back to the employee.
Thank you. Great. Any other questions for Ms. Kelly before we go on to Johnson? Mr. Weddle.
Mr. Papa, if you don't pay properly, don't they get terminated?
If an employer doesn't pay an employee properly, they are subject to basically double generally. So it's the amount of the unpaid wages plus that same amount in liquidated damages.
And then, I have a pretty simple business, but my workers' comp attorney, we have to say how many employees are what classification, then they come on site. I mean, is that done? I assume that's done everywhere. And the construction company seems like they would ferret out this problem.
Wage and Hour doesn't have a lot of resources to go out on site. They do sometimes, but with the caseload they have, the amount of claims coming in, generally the resources are focused on working internally. But yes, Wage and Hour does and can do on-site checks.
But not you, my insurance company.
Oh,
I pay them a lot of money and they come and check on me, and I find it a pretty simple business.
I definitely cannot speak to workers' compensation and insurance companies and what they do. I'm sorry. Bronson looks like he has some insight.
Yeah, go ahead.
The chair.
Fry.
Part of the problem is that in construction, by the nature of the work, employees bounce around all the time. They're never in one place for any length of time, and it's kind of unpredictable how long they will be in any one place. So the logistics of actually doing on-site visits on a construction company are far different than somebody who's got a storefront that they can just go in and know that everybody for that company can be in one spot all the time. And so it makes it a lot harder for them, and it doesn't happen as much as it probably should.
And that's another point, is in the case where construction contractors misclassifying their employees as subcontractors, there would be no workers' compensation insurance or really
That's part of the problem,
much
right?
oversight at
Yeah.
all.
But they go on site and they talk to the employees. So they ask, are you getting paid for your contract? So I don't know, I'm looking at that.
Boy, I think in
I
the
assume that was the enforcement mechanism, is the insurance company
Yeah.
watching out for them.
a lot of times there is no policy in place, so that's kind of that's the actual problem that we're dealing with. So they have been misclassified as independent contractors, therefore the employer does not buy a workers' comp policy, and there's no insurance company there to do that investigation.
Your insurance company might also just be comic book fans and make excuses to come to your shop.
Well, that's-
Who wouldn't
that's
be?
the question.
We got Suzanne and then Suzanne.
Quick question. Thank you.
France.
Mr. Chair. So just so I'm clear, this is, the data here is just for construction
Is that right?
contractors?
No, this data is for all wage and hour activity.
In Anchorage.
And do you know what breakout among different groups or industry? It may be on here.
No, this does not break it down by industry, and I apologize. I should have gone over the scope a little better. This report is wage and hours activity report for the Anchorage office. So this can include wage claims from all over the state. Generally, it only includes wage claims from the South Central area.
Thank you.
My
Thank you.
question was for John.
Yeah.
Was your insurance audit surprise, or did they?
No, it's routine. You know, every year you kind of go and say, here's my employees, here's their classifications, you know, your estimate. You know, payroll. You get fined when every company does this. But mine, retail is low, workers' comp. But if you're a roofer or something like
Sure.
that, it's really high. And there's a much bigger incentive to
Right.
kind of skirt the issue. But, so I don't know, I mean, this,
Yeah.
what you guys do, I all to me, I kind of assume, I mean, I'm glad to see the checks, because I run an honest, decent business, and I wouldn't want to have to compete against people who are cheating the system.
Yeah.
It's not fair.
That's a good point.
Great point.
Mr. Fry, would you speak a little bit more about worker misclassification?
Sure. So my experience is in the construction background, and Ms. Kelly's actually given a pretty great overview of the issues. So maybe what I can do is provide some of the context of why this happens and why it's particularly a problem in construction. So essentially what we see is a business model that certain unscrupulous employers have adopted, whereby they're requiring as a condition of employment that their workers go out and get a business license and then self-perform as so-called independent subcontractors or owner-operators. And if you are a true independent contractor, you have the right to waive workers' compensation on yourself if you're going to be an employee of your own company. So now the contractor who bids a construction job and has all of his employees classified as contractors has shifted the burden for liability for injury at work down onto those workers. So if they choose to buy a workers' comp policy on themselves and take it out of their own pay, they can do that. If not, that's their business. But at the end of the day, this contractor has enabled himself to cut his labor cost by up to 30%. And that is because, like you pointed out, Mr. Weddleton, construction workers' comp is much higher than other industries. So there is definitely a big incentive there. The other big incentive that makes construction, or makes this particular big problem in construction, is the bidding process that is unique to that industry. So while there are different industries that have independent contractors that may or may not be classified hairdressers, estheticians, tattoo artists, exotic dancers, the list goes on and on, none of those trades involve a bidding process. the way that construction does. And so generally speaking, when you're a construction contractor and you're sitting down to prepare a bid for a job, you're looking at the blueprints and the plans. You have your material costs, which are approximately the same for everybody, your price for lumber, a bucket of paint, whatever. Overhead, the cost of the time it takes to look at the prints and, you know, keep the lights on in your office, etc. Again, depending on the size of your business, about the same for everyone. Your profit, the amount, the percent that you add to the end of your total bid, it's what you take home and put in your pocket. That percentage is about the same in each industry, electrical, roofing, general contracting. And then you have your labor cost, which is the only real variable in the process. So if you can cut your labor cost by 30% by misclassifying all of your workers as independent contractors, you give yourself a massive advantage over honest and law-abiding businesses. So same way Mr. Weddleton doesn't want to compete against a company that doesn't have to pay workers' comp, nobody in the construction industry should be asked to do that either. And what happens is businesses that are honest are either forced to adopt this unscrupulous business model, or they just go out of business because they get no work. So that is kind of the nature of the beast here that we're trying to address. I can speak anecdotally of my own experience in the industry. I started an apprenticeship in the Painters and Drywall Finishers Union 2 weeks out of high school in 2001, and have seen in the painting industry, drywall industry, floor covering industry, acoustical ceilings, guys that install grid, and various other trades, this business model become more and more prevalent. And it kind of, the ultimate example is the Denina Center downtown, funded partially with city money. When I requested certified payroll from the Department of Labor, again, there's pretty good record keeping on prevailed wage public money jobs. There were 13 independent contractors working for one paint and drywall company. I would go on site, I would look at them, they're in the same scissor lift, working on the same walls. They've got one employer, the guy that bid the job, provide all the material. There'd be a pallet of, you know, box of drywall mud with his company name on it. They have all their tools in the same box and the whole 9 yards. So clearly there was direction and control from one employer. There was a supply of all materials for the project by one employer, tools, so on and so forth. And yet all of these workers, all 13 of them, were so-called independent contractors. Because of my work in the industry, I know what the bids were, you know, for the next, you know, number 2, number 3, number 4. And when you're cutting $500,000 off a $3 million bid, you know, there's that big of a gap between 1 and 2. It's not a mystery why. It's not a mystery how. And it's because of this business model. So that, you know, just kind of my experience and why I think it's particularly relevant to the construction industry. And I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody has about any of that.
So the Denina example, I think, is also particularly useful because it's a very large project. So I'm wondering, how long were those guys independent contractors for that one employer?
On that one job?
Yeah.
Oh shoot, that thing went at least a year. I mean, that thing went on for months.
Right.
Probably at least a year, maybe 2.
Right.
I can't even remember.
Right, and so under the laws they have at the state, I mean, were they violating the state laws that now stands, do you feel, Ms. Kelly?
It sounds like what Bronson describes, that would be a violation, yes.
Yeah. Are there any other questions for Mr. Fry about these sort of things?
So,
Mr. Hahn?
for Ms. Kelly then. So now we've talked about the problem. What are the solutions? Did they hand you that scope to talk about?
Well, didn't you? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but Bronson, didn't you work on HB 79?
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah.
So maybe you could both speak to it.
Sure.
Well, yeah, HB 79 is a great example. A better independent contractor and employee definition test that can be applied is really helpful for both enforcement agencies and for employers and for workers, so that they can see exactly what it means to be an employee or an independent contractor and follow that. The debarment process that's in place for prevailing wage violators, it's cumbersome, but it does work in cases where people refuse to comply with the law. It keeps prevailing wage violators from continuing to contract with the state. they are given a 3-year debarment, and after that, hopefully they come back having learned something. Those are both tools that have been pretty effective.
I think House Bill 79, much of it just went into effect in November. So as far as the enforcement, that's something we're looking forward to at this point. But there's definitely a broad issue here across the state. Mr. Constant had a thought on something else you brought up earlier regarding safety, and the reason that this is a major safety issue in construction is that when this business model is adopted, there is much lower, if any, emphasis placed on safety when the liability for injury at work has been shifted down onto the workers themselves. The company is by nature not incentivized to put that emphasis on safety at all, because the liability is not there for them, at least in their mind. And unfortunately, it leads to events like the retaining wall collapsing, an investigation opening up, finding out that there had been wrongdoing from the very beginning, and perhaps somebody died because of it.
Mr. Trainee?
Chris, you've got orders coming forward on this. What's the administration's position? Do we have anything from administration?
They haven't seen it, yeah.
Okay.
The whole purpose of today's meeting is to discuss kind of the.
Chris, I didn't know how far you were, so I wanted to find out from that. The other question is, we just had a change of administration. Who's going to be pushing this now on the state? Who's going to be overseeing this, do you know? Or is it something going to be a House bill that was passed and forgotten?
Boy, I'd love to answer that for you. I will do what I can in my limited ability to keep an eye on this as an issue. It's part of my duties and my job as a representative of workers in the construction industry here. As far as the state, I can't speak to what their enforcement interest is going to be, or hopefully it's things continue on progressing like I think they have the last few years.
Well, I think Chris, what question you also might have been asking, that sort of short-circuited. And there are other people I see from the construction trades here. If any of them want to answer this, if they happen to know, or if Mr. Gates knows this from his research, I don't think he sees this. So, we know what the laws at the state level. What can the municipality do, and also sort of have other municipalities set up their own codes on this, or do people just generally rely on state law? Is there anyone capable of answering that question? If you want to speak up, please come sit up front and state your name for the record.
Serena Green, attorney for the IBW.
Great.
Things that the Assembly can do is work on an ordinance that addresses these issues that will not allow these repeat offenders to get contracts that the city is issuing. Is essentially the ultimate plan. You can also revise your criminal code to talk about wage theft, to incorporate wage theft in particular, and define what that means. So there's lots of different ways that the municipality can address this issue.
And Chris, have you been having Dean do some research on this for you?
I've been working with outside parties.
Okay.
We've crafted something. Dean has seen it, and we're in conversation now about where we're going to go.
So I'm curious,
Maybe he hasn't.
have any other cities around Alaska passed ordinances on this? And I know that it's often the case that Anchorage is the first one in Alaska. But then are there other cities in the lower 48 that have done this, and what have their ordinances looked like? Or counties?
Yeah, there has been other communities at the local level that have addressed this issue, but I don't actually have that information. We were going to try to have a woman named Evelyn Shapiro, who's from the Carpenters Union. She's based out of Seattle, but she was not available today. But she will be available. I'm meeting with her on Monday to talk about these issues and what other communities are doing. Because I imagine we're going to have a couple work sessions on this topic, and then we'll have the information about that at that time.
Great. Mr. Peterson, then Mr. Dyson, and Mr. Weldon. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so, the situation with the gentleman who was killed when the wall collapsed, is there a punishment? Does his boss possibly get jail time, or is it just a big fine? Or typically, what do other states or jurisdictions have set up for punishments?
I can speak to what this state has set up for punishment in that case. Because in this case, they had evidence to show that this person was an employee and not an independent contractor, the employer was subject to a fine of, I don't remember the exact amount, but I believe it was over $200,000. They would also be subject to criminal penalties for willful violations resulting in the death of employee, or can result into a $20,000 criminal fine as well, and I believe it's a misdemeanor, but it's still a criminal conviction. And then because he didn't have workers' compensation, there's also the possibility that, you know, there could be civil lawsuits involved from the family.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Fred, Mr. Dyson.
Thank you, Chair. What does the state or we do with so-called day labor? You know, people just hire on them for a day.
Generally, day laborers aren't seen any differently than any other employee. They are considered to be employees, and that can get really involved if we start going down that rabbit hole. But if they're just going to, say, labor ready and getting a job, then labor ready and the employer that they're sent out to do the work would have a joint responsibility to ensure that that employee is covered by various laws.
So they gotta have workers' comp and all that kind of thing for a guy that just works one day?
Yes, unless they're a legitimate independent contractor.
So the folks we have around that are kind of in the quote homeless thing, they get a snow shovel and go up and down the street and offer to clear people's roofs and paths and stuff, and do it on an hourly basis, that's illegal?
I don't know the specifics of the situation. It would really depend on how it's set up. I'm not a workers' comp expert, but I know that workers' compensation insurance is set up to handle employees coming in and going out. So it's not like they're going to have to, the employer would have to.
The bottom line is, as you understand the law, you can't do that without going through some bureaucratic process.
I wouldn't say that, no. I don't, I'm not a workers' comp
Yeah.
expert again, but I don't think that the person has to go and like get a workers' comp policy for that employee for that day. They can have a policy that covers that sort of work.
Or the store owner that agrees to pay the guy a few bucks for clearing his roof, gutters, or sidewalks. He doesn't either.
That would have to be a conversation with
Right,
workers'
right,
compensation.
yeah.
I apologize.
As you all would know, there's a lot of folks that want part-time work have gone to businesses the last 10 days and said, want me to help clean up your shop? You know, pay me $15 an hour, and I applaud that. You can see how it works for everybody, and but that's not the kind of exploitation we're trying to cure. But I worry that we preclude that kind of individual initiative. So we can think about that.
Mr. Fry, you want to speak to that?
I would just suggest that any employer that was looking to hire somebody, even on a small-time, basis or something like that, to help clean up a shop, would probably want to put them on payroll and have their workers' compensation policy cover them, because if they're injured, the employer would potentially be open to lawsuit.
Yeah,
and the reason workers' comp's there to protect the employer also.
So you can't do it for just a few hours,
Well,
2 hours on a business. Or my 2 grandsons who are out doing gardening work and raking leaves and stuff, they're in trouble.
Well, I know there are legal exceptions for family members.
But
There are just.
they're not doing it for their family, they're doing it for their neighbors.
When at home, I don't know about working in someone's home or homeowner's insurance, or in a business, I guess those would probably be different, but I understand your point.
Yeah,
Sure.
right.
Serena, and then Mr. Weddleton. Yeah, Mr. Weddleton.
The workers' compensation on your payroll, so I can hire people all year long. I don't tell my insurance company who they are, and I don't do the casual labor thing, but you report on your workers' comp casual labor, they see that payroll, and you get workers' comp, so they are covered. You don't have to tell the insurance company day by day, hey, this guy shut my driving, because you record it. So that it is allowed.
I'm sure the homeowners that employ my grandsons are probably not going to do that.
Well, I mean, but is it
And I can speak
Yeah, Serena, then.
I'll let Deb talk about that since.
Okay.
Just as far as the homeowners hiring neighborhood kids, I could say that there are a lot of exceptions out there for homeowners hiring contractors in general, or hiring people to do work. And with something like homeowners hiring a kid to do basic casual labor, that's one of those things that I have never heard of a state agency or any agency enforcing, and it's something that only comes up if there's a problem. So if that kid is out mowing the lawn and a stick gets thrown up and puts their eye out, there could be a big problem. But when that doesn't happen, there's no one out there enforcing that.
Yeah, that's reasonable, thank you.
Mr. Croft has the statute in front of him.
Yeah, so AS 2330-230, the following persons are not covered by this chapter: a part-time babysitter, a cleaning person, and I think 3, harvest help and similar part-time or transient help.
A person employed as a sports official.
Yeah, that was a specific case. But, anyway,
Sorry, what was that last one?
sports official. So there was.
A commercial fisherman's in that too, so I didn't have workman's comp when I was on those decks, I guess. Didn't realize it as a 17-year-old. Let's see, there was, John, do you have another question?
You know, it's a little broader than whatever Chris was working on. I think there are a couple issues on this. I think this was dealt with before, but you know, we would have a bad contractor with company XYZ, and you say, well, we're not going to let them bid anymore, so the owner goes and creates a company ABC.
Yeah.
So when you do this, kind of watch that. I know we've dealt with this years ago, whether it's in there or not. But you're also talking mostly here wage and hour safety things, but there's other things that you know, poor workmanship and stuff. And I think because they'll just form another company, they may be able to bid on the projects again. But it'd be great if you would look into that. Because it's not taking care of it, added into this whole process.
Sure, that's fair.
Yeah, and just carrying on, I mean, it's even tougher for us, right? If your own company can say, oh, I know, I've dealt with him before, I'm not going to do that. But we have so many rules that you might be locked into, I really don't want to deal with Joe, but I almost have.
Yeah.
I have another question.
Yeah, Mr. Constant, you next on my list.
I'm just going to slightly get narrow to Bronson just for maybe 2 or 3 minutes. You covered closely the misclassification. You didn't really give a discussion about the wage theft experience you've seen or have. And so can you just tap into that just for a minute? I'm sure there's more conversation about that.
The wage theft that I've seen has, again, we're talking about the paint and drywall industry. A lot of immigrant workers, first off, victimized more so disproportionately in my experience. And a lot of it is unpaid overtime and prevailing wage violations. Ms. Kelly's report showed that there was, because of the record keeping, a lot of prevailing wage violations you'd see. I think $15,000 is the most ever that I helped a person retrieve through the DOL wage claim, and he was a Hispanic painter that was working and traveling extensively over the course of several years for work, and had not been paid any overtime and had not been paid any travel time, you know, for the company. And in that particular case, the worker had kept extensive records. Like, he had a little notebook where he wrote everything down, which was awesome. And so I just helped him really fill out the paperwork at the DOL. It was the Department of Labor that went after the employer and recovered all of that money for him. Another example I like to give is we used to have a Mexican consulate in Anchorage. It's since moved, but they was able to develop a relationship with them, and they reached out to me because a woman from Mexico who was here as a political refugee with her husband was cleaning the old Fireweed Theater, the movie theater, and went outside and taking the trash out to the dumpster and broke her wrist. And she went to the hospital and said, I was hurt at work. I work for this company. They called the guy, it was some guy down in California, and he goes, I never heard of that person. They don't work for me. And the Division of Workers' Compensation Fraud Investigation, I contacted them and was able to kind of plug all the parties together. And ultimately, that employer, that became like a banner case for the workers' comp fraud. I want to say it was Winters Cleaning or something like that. But ultimately, there was medical bills were covered. There was back pay for the months of time they were off as though they had worked full time. And then the company was essentially ran out of the state. They ran cleaning operations up and down the West Coast, basically, and would hire people and then not pay them and not have comp policies. So they are no longer welcome here. And as far as I know, they've been gone now for a few years. But as far as these type of issues, they take on various forms, but they happen a lot. And you're going to help the broader community by addressing these issues at the Assembly, because it affects all of us.
Thank you, Mr. Fry. So, we have some time now coming to the end. We're going to have some audience participation. If y'all want to go first.
Yeah, just to address the question about whether other communities are doing this, I was just looking through my stuff. The City of Boston has an executive order they've issued regarding wage theft. City of Seattle has an ordinance addressing these issues. DC has an ordinance addressing these issues, and so does Chicago. So those are other places to look into.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So maybe Mr. Gage could take a look at some of those other codes and see what they're doing, so we might be able to learn from the experiences.
I can send it to him.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I think Mr. Constant is going to be submitting something relatively soon. Mr. Fields, Representative Zach Fields, would you like to? There you go.
Vince, earlier someone asked about kind of past enforcement and the size of the fines, and I just want to point out that it was only under the Walker administration that there were fines of this magnitude for violations like this, and before that, really a company could repeatedly violate the law and pay very small fines, even for worker fatalities, and have that just be part of the cost of doing business.
So was that was there a change because of the change of the law, or just a change in sort of the administration's desire to enforce the law?
The latter.
Okay.
So, I think for the Assembly to put criminal penalties in place is really a smart move, because you're not kind of leaving enforcement to the whims of one administration, or relying on someone like Deborah, who did a great job as a division director. But if you have criminal penalties in place, then you're ensuring that at least in Anchorage, there are meaningful penalties for employers who egregiously violate the law. And on that point, I want to point out there are multiple state attorneys general across the country who are now beginning to prosecute labor violations as criminal violations. And of course, it depends state to state on what the laws are. Some states are actually looking to put stronger criminal penalties in place for labor law violations. But all of that is just a recognition that for far too long, a few bad actors have been able to systematically violate labor laws and pay very minor fines and have that be part of the cost of doing business, and frankly, they still make money, and they abuse people's rights along the way. So I think that the criminal penalties is really an important piece, and it's one that a lot of states and localities are working on. Thanks.
Yeah, and Secretary Costa for the Department of Labor federally was up here speaking, and under the Trump administration is looking at criminally prosecuting these bad actors who are doing major wage theft, workers' misclassification, and I think they may have had a case out of Florida where they had contractors jailed for, up to 3 years.
Well, Mr. Constant?
Yeah, I'm not sure that the draft we've been working on has criminal penalties, but I think we've been discussing this debarment from any future work for a period of time. And so that's a conversation that may percolate up, but I think at this time, the scope is not that broad.
Well, we'll see. Mr. Fry, and then I do want to leave a little time for the audience before we break.
Okay. Just one thing on what Representative-elect Fields just brought up about protections for workers not being in place under this business model. If a employee or worker is classified as an independent contractor, not only are they not covered by workers' comp, that employer is not paying taxes, so we've got tax fraud, but they're also, none of the protections of the National Labor Relations Act apply to that worker because they're not an employee. So you're talking about a whole-scale violation of this worker's rights, violating the NLRA, which is one of the things that makes this country great. And so this business model is undermining some of the very values that all of us love about this country.
Thank you, Mr. Fry. Okay, at this time, we have 3 minutes left. Is there anyone here in the audience who would like to participate? Not seeing anyone? No? Okay. All right, we'll take a short break before our next work session.